I never thought I'd reach a point where I would sever ties with my mother completely. But when her actions began endangering my son, I knew I had no choice. My mother, Sylvia, has always been a difficult woman. At 56, she has spent most of her life harboring bitterness, a trait that was excused by those around her because of the trauma she endured. She lost my father unexpectedly and was left to raise me and my younger sister, Jane, all on her own. From as early as I can remember, my mother had a hardened heart. While others pitied her struggles, I was the one who bore the brunt of her coldness. As a child, I was full of life, always running outside, eager to explore, and flashing smiles at strangers. But that warmth was never reflected back at me by my mother. She remained distant, emotionally unavailable, and at times, outright dismissive. My sister was just 2 years old when our father died, so from a young age, I instinctively took on the role of caretaker. I fed her, entertained her, and did everything I could to lighten my mother's load, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she would see my efforts and appreciate me. She didn't. The small acknowledgments I received were the closest thing to love I ever got from her. Over time, the lack of affection took its toll on me. I grew frustrated, resentful, and eventually, I started rebelling. If she already saw me as an ungrateful child, then I might as well live up to her expectations. By the time I was 13, I was working part-time, handling household chores, and babysitting Jane, only for my mother to come home and nitpick over the smallest of things. Nothing was ever good enough. Our home was a battleground. Arguments became a daily ritual. And eventually, I withdrew entirely. Jane, sensing the shift, tried to bridge the gap between us. But I was too hardened by my mother's treatment to reciprocate. As the years passed, the favoritism became undeniable. Jane was the golden child. My mother made it clear where her affections lay. She didn't even attend my high school graduation because Jane had a mild fever that day. That moment solidified everything I had suspected for years. I was an afterthought. As soon as I graduated, I fled to another city for college and never looked back. My mother and I had no contact, and neither of us made an effort to change that. Jane and I still exchanged casual texts, but our relationship remained distant. Life went on. I got married in college, had a son, Jaden, and quickly learned that life had more challenges in store for me. Jaden was diagnosed with multiple life-threatening allergies. The safest option for him was a carefully controlled diet, so we adopted a vegan lifestyle as per the doctor's recommendations. It was difficult but necessary. During this time, my marriage took a dark turn. My husband became abusive, and after enduring it for as long as I could, I finally left. I filed for divorce and moved back to my hometown, hoping for a fresh start. Jane, upon hearing of my return, reached out. She wanted to reconnect, and though hesitant, I agreed to let her visit. But she wasn't alone. My mother was with her. Seeing my mother after years of no contact was jarring. She acted as if nothing had ever happened between us, as if she hadn't ignored me for years. I wanted to confront her, but Jaden was so overjoyed to have new company that I bit my tongue. That night, after Jaden had gone to bed, I finally addressed the elephant in the room. I asked her why she had never tried to reach out. Why she had let our relationship deteriorate without a second thought. Before she could answer, Jane jumped in, apologizing on my mother's behalf. She called this unexpected visit an olive branch, an opportunity to rebuild the family I had lost. I wasn't convinced, but as I looked at my son, so happy, so unaware of the past pain between us, I decided to try. Not for my mother, not for myself, but for him. At first, things seemed manageable. I had found a stable marketing job that allowed me to work from home, which made caring for Jaden easier. Jane visited occasionally, and my mother, though still overbearing, made frequent appearances to see Jaden. But it didn't take long before the cracks started showing. She came over almost every weekend, supposedly to help, but instead, she took control. She rearranged my home without asking, criticized my parenting, and acted as if I was a guest in my own house. At first, I let it slide. I told myself this was just her personality, that she wasn't intentionally being overbearing. But when it became too much, I asked Jane to intervene. That was a mistake. The next day, my mother called me, furious that I had complained to my sister instead of addressing her directly. I tried to de-escalate, telling her it wasn't the right time for this conversation. But she wouldn't stop. Frustrated, I put her on speakerphone and went back to my work. Realizing I wasn't listening, she hung up. Later that night, Jane called, saying that Mom had been crying over the way I had handled things. I was stunned. After years of emotional neglect, favoritism, and outright cruelty, my mother was now playing the victim because I had refused to be controlled? I told Jane, clearly and firmly, that I would no longer be manipulated. My mother was to stay out of my and Jaden's life, at least for a while. Jane didn't take it well. She pleaded with me to reconsider, arguing that Jaden shouldn't be deprived of his grandmother. But I refused. My mother had made it abundantly clear throughout my life that she had no room for me in her heart. I wasn't about to let her treat my son the same way. And so, I cut ties again. At the time, I didn't realize that this was only the beginning of the storm. My mother, unwilling to let go, would soon find another way to break my trust, and this time, it would put Jaden's life at risk. And that was something I could never forgive. After my mother's dramatic outburst over my refusal to let her control my life, I thought the distance between us would bring peace. And for a while, it did. Jane, ever the peacemaker, tried to convince me not to cut Mom off from Jaden completely. But when she realized how firm I was, she relented. Mom herself sent a text apologizing for her behavior and promised to keep her distance. A year passed. Jane graduated from college, and Jaden turned 4, old enough to be left with a trusted babysitter if needed. With my career picking up, emergencies came up more frequently, and Jane often stepped in to watch Jaden. We weren't close, but we had an unspoken agreement: she would help when she could. And I wouldn't expect more than she was willing to give. Despite the distance, I still saw my mother on occasion, mostly at family gatherings. Birthdays, or holidays, things were civil, almost as if our explosive arguments had never happened. But deep down, I knew that the peace was temporary. One day, an urgent work issue came up, and Jane had an interview that same afternoon. She suggested that Mom watch Jaden. My first instinct was to refuse. But I hesitated. It had been over a year since our fallout, and I wanted to believe that maybe she had changed. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I dropped Jaden off, I went over his allergies, again, explaining how even a trace of the wrong ingredient could send him to the hospital. I handed her a printed list of foods he couldn't eat and emphasized how serious this was. She scoffed. "You can trust me with your child," she said dismissively. "I raised you, didn't I?" I swallowed my irritation and reminded her to call me if anything happened. She nodded, and I left, convincing myself that surely she wouldn't be reckless with her own grandson. It was only a few hours. What could go wrong? Everything. Less than 2 hours later, I got a frantic call telling me to get to the hospital immediately. My heart stopped. I barely managed an apology to my boss before racing out the door. When I arrived, I found Jaden hooked up to monitors, his small body recovering from a severe allergic reaction. The doctor told me he had ingested gluten, one of the very things I had warned my mother about. I was livid. I stormed out into the waiting room, where my mother sat, looking more annoyed than guilty. I didn't even let her speak before demanding an explanation. She tried to deflect at first, blaming Jaden for getting into the cookies when she wasn't looking. But when I pressed, she admitted it. She hadn't checked the cheat sheet. She hadn't taken my instructions seriously. I was done. "You will never be alone with Jaden again," I told her, my voice shaking with rage. She started crying, saying it was a mistake, that she didn't mean to hurt him, that I was being too harsh. But this wasn't about a simple mistake. This was negligence. This was playing with my child's life. Jane arrived soon after, and I sent her to sit with Jaden while I dealt with Mom. The argument that followed was one of the worst we had ever had. Mom kept trying to excuse her actions, while I refused to let her shift the blame. In the end, she left in tears, and Jane followed. Later that night, I received a text from Jane, accusing me of overreacting. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that if she defended Mom's actions, she would be cut off too. She backed down. After that, I made permanent arrangements. I hired a full-time babysitter, Nancy, from a reputable agency that performed background checks. I no longer needed to rely on Jane or anyone else in my family. The distance between Jane and me grew. She still visited Jaden occasionally, but her presence became less and less frequent. After she landed a job, our relationship returned to what it had been before, polite but distant. She sent the occasional text asking about Jaden, but we rarely spoke about our personal lives. And I was fine with that. Then, months later, I found myself in another bind. It was a Saturday, and I had an important work commitment. Coincidentally, it was also the day of Jaden's monthly doctor's appointment. Nancy, my trusted babysitter, was at the hospital with her own sick child. I hesitated but decided to reach out to Jane, hoping she could step in. She answered, but her response wasn't what I expected. "I can't," she said, sounding hesitant. "I have work." Then, after a pause, she added, "Why don't you ask Mom?" I was about to refuse, ready to remind her of the last time Mom had been left alone with Jaden. But before I could speak, I heard something in the background. My mother. Not realizing I was on the phone, she started ranting. "I wouldn't babysit Jaden even if I was being paid. I have my own life. Why does she always expect me to deal with that child and his ridiculous condition?" I froze. Jane must have tried to stop her. But Mom kept going. "She brought this on herself. She wants to play the perfect mother. But all she's doing is keeping that burden to herself. Let her deal with it alone." That was all I needed to hear. I hung up on Jane and immediately called my mother. She answered, her tone instantly shifting into a sickeningly sweet apology. "Oh, sweetheart, I was just frustrated. I had brunch plans with Jane, and I cut her off. I never want to hear from you again." She stammered, tried to backpedal, but I wasn't interested. I made it clear. She had lost the privilege of being in our lives. I blocked her number. Jane, clearly shaken, sent me a few apologetic texts. But I ignored them. Not only had she lied about having work, but she had allowed Mom to spew that hatred, knowing full well what had happened the last time Jaden was left in her care. I took the rest of the day off and took Jaden to his appointment myself. And from that moment forward, I made a conscious decision. My family no longer existed. A year passed. Jaden would still ask about his grandmother from time to time, and it hurt to see his little face light up at the mention of someone who had nearly cost him his life. But I made sure to redirect his attention, keeping him busy with school, activities, and time with friends. It wasn't easy, but I refused to let my past define his future. I had spent my entire childhood begging for scraps of affection from a mother who never saw me as enough. I would not let Jaden grow up longing for love from someone who didn't deserve him. I was done, and this time, I wasn't looking back. Jaden's 5th birthday was supposed to be a joyful milestone. We had already picked a school for him to start kindergarten, and I wanted to make his celebration special, surrounded by people who truly cared about him. I sent out a few invitations, including one to Jane, but not to my mother. Jane attended, as expected, and brought a large bag of gifts, which, at first glance, looked expensive. The sheer extravagance made me uncomfortable. I didn't want her spending so much on Jaden when he would likely move on to a new toy within days. I gently told her she didn't need to go all out, but she quickly clarified, only one of the wrapped gifts was from her. The rest were from Mom. I froze. I hadn't invited Mom for a reason, and now she was trying to force her way into Jaden's life through material gestures. I told Jane to take the gifts back, but she refused, insisting that she didn't want to be caught in the middle of our feud. "You don't have to accept Mom back into your life," she reasoned, "but at least let her be there for Jaden. It's the least she can do." I hated that Jane had put it that way because a small part of me felt guilty. Had I been too harsh? Jaden loved his grandmother when she was around. Was I keeping them apart for something that only I considered serious? I decided to call my mother after the party to talk things through. That night, when the guests had left, Jaden excitedly went through his presents. Naturally, he was most drawn to the large bag from his grandmother. As he unwrapped the first gift, I exhaled in relief. It was just a plushie. A small school bag. Then, I reached in for more and felt my stomach drop. Inside the bag were multiple boxes of cookies from an upscale bakery. Cookies filled with ingredients that could literally kill my son. She hadn't even checked. She hadn't even thought to check. She had been so focused on making a grand gesture that she had completely ignored the fact that her gift could have put Jaden in the hospital, again. I immediately decided that Jaden wouldn't see the rest of the contents. I told him the plushie was all that was in the bag, hoping he would be satisfied. But 5-year-olds are persistent. He dug through the bag himself and pulled out the cookies. "Mommy, can I have one?" My heart clenched. I calmly told him that those cookies weren't safe for him. But he didn't understand. He only saw that they were a gift from Grandma. Why would they be bad? He threw a tantrum, demanding that I open the box. It became clear that no matter what I said, he wouldn't believe me, so I called my mother. She answered almost too eagerly, as if expecting an apology, expecting gratitude for her thoughtful present. Instead, I asked her to explain to Jaden that the cookies weren't for him. Her entire demeanor changed. She scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake, stop being dramatic. I raised 2 kids just fine." I reminded her, yet again, that Jaden had life-threatening allergies, that her negligence could have landed him in the hospital again. That was when she snapped. "If you weren't such a weird hippie," she spat, "raising your son on some alternative diet, maybe he wouldn't have these issues. Normal kids eat normal food. Maybe if you let him eat real food instead of whatever nonsense you're feeding him, he'd be healthier." I was stunned. Did she really think Jaden's allergies were my fault? That they were a choice? I could have argued. I could have screamed. But I didn't have time for that. I had a 5-year-old throwing a fit in front of me, clutching a box of dangerous food because his grandmother, who he loved and trusted, had sent it to him. "Tell him the cookies aren't for him," I repeated. She grumbled, but after some resistance, she finally told Jaden that they were not meant for him, and that she would bring his real gift tomorrow. Jaden, thankfully, accepted this and let the cookies go. I thanked her for calming the situation and hung up before she could say more. But after the call, I spiraled. Her words stuck in my head. Was she right? Had I somehow caused Jaden's health issues? Had I overreacted? Was I the problem? Old wounds from childhood reopened. The way she had always dismissed my feelings. The way she had made me feel like an inconvenience, an afterthought. And now, she was doing the same to my son, invalidating something that could endanger his life. I called Jane, hoping she would offer some clarity, some comfort. Instead, she sighed and said, "That's just how Mom is. Let it go." Something in me snapped. From that moment, I decided I would never discuss my problems with Jane again. And I wasn't letting this slide. I didn't let her in. "You're not happy with me or my lifestyle," I told her. "You've made that clear. But if you're willing to put Jaden's life at risk just to make a point, then you don't deserve to be in his life." She gasped, as if I had slapped her. "I raised you," she said, voice trembling. "And this is how you repay me? By stealing my grandson from me?" I didn't budge. She shifted tactics, trying to guilt-trip me. "What about the gifts? The money I spent? You'd throw all that away?" Without hesitation, I turned, went inside, gathered the bag of presents, and shoved them back into her hands. Then, I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check on the spot to cover the one gift Jaden had already opened. Her eyes widened. "There's no need to be petty." "This isn't pettiness," I said. "This is me cutting ties. No obligations, no strings attached." She left, disappointed, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No guilt, no sadness, just relief. I told him that Grandma would be gone for some time, because she had personal plans. He didn't question it much, and I hoped that as time passed, he would stop asking about her. Then, Jane called. She was hysterical. Apparently, Mom had returned home and thrown a tantrum so severe that she had made herself sick. "Just apologize and make peace," Jane pleaded. I let out a hollow laugh. "That's how Mom is. She'll be fine." Jane was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice laced with disappointment, she called me unempathetic and hung up. That was fine by me. I knew my relationship with Jane had been affected beyond repair, and I had made peace with the fact that Jaden might never see his grandmother again. And you know what? I was okay with that. Because protecting my child was more important than keeping up the illusion of family. Am I the a-hole for this? Thank you to everyone who has supported me. After reading your comments, I've realized I was never in the wrong. I still regret how things ended with Jane, but she refuses to see the harm in our mother's actions. And I won't apologize for protecting my son. Not now. Not ever. I've long accepted that Jane and I were raised differently, not because of anything we did, but because of the way my mother chose to parent us. Jane was the golden child, the easygoing one who never challenged authority. And as a result, she was showered with affection. I, on the other hand, was the child who pushed back, who wanted love and fairness. and was punished for it. Still, I never held resentment toward Jane. I understood that it wasn't her fault. She had spent her whole life playing the peacemaker, trying to balance her relationship with both Mom and me. But what she never realized was that real relationships aren't built on appeasement, they require boundaries, respect, and accountability. And now, she was learning the hard way, facing Mom's manipulative tantrums firsthand. A week had passed since my last fight with my mother, and I hadn't heard a word about her from Jaden, which was a relief. But knowing her, I suspected it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Just to be safe, I planned a short vacation for Jaden and me before his school started, a way for us to reset, away from the drama. Before we could leave, I got an unexpected call from my paternal aunt. I hadn't mentioned my extended family much because, frankly, they weren't a meaningful part of my life. Most of them had excused or outright ignored my mother's treatment of me as a child. They either enabled her or turned a blind eye. I had no reason to stay in touch with them beyond occasional pleasantries. So, when my aunt called, I assumed something serious had happened. The second I answered, she unleashed a tirade about how my mother had been hospitalized, and I hadn't even bothered to visit her. I was stunned. I asked how she knew, and she claimed Mom had called her and a few other relatives, telling them how I had abandoned her. The manipulation was textbook. Rather than take responsibility for her actions, she had spun a sob story to make me look like the villain. I had no desire to explain myself to someone who had never been on my side. So I simply said, "It's complicated, stay out of it." That, of course, didn't go over well. She started calling me names: ungrateful, heartless, a terrible daughter, but I hung up mid-rant. I knew the calls wouldn't stop, so I preemptively blocked her number, hoping that would send a message to the rest of the family. The next day, Jaden and I left for our trip. 2 weeks of bliss. No phone calls, no arguments, just time with my son. I intentionally stayed offline, detaching myself from the toxic cycle I had been trapped in for so long. When I finally checked my phone, I wasn't surprised to see a few missed calls from relatives. I ignored them. Then, I noticed some messages, angry ones from unknown numbers, accusing me of being a selfish, inconsiderate daughter and an unfit mother. Mom had doubled down on her victim narrative, and now distant relatives, who had never lifted a finger to help me when I was struggling, were suddenly experts on how I should handle my relationship with her. I rolled my eyes. There was no reasoning with these people, and I wasn't about to waste my breath trying. Instead, I turned to the one person who might actually listen, Jane. She had also called me several times, so I figured I should at least return the favor. She didn't answer, which wasn't surprising. Assuming she was at work, I left her a voice note, keeping my message short and clear. "Keep an eye on Mom. She's spreading lies about me again. Consider this a warning. If the harassment from relatives continues, you'll face the consequences too." That got her attention. She called me back that same night. At first, she acted like nothing had happened, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Get to the point, Jane," she sighed. "Mom wants to talk to you." "Just once." I scoffed. "Why would I put myself through that? She's been suffering," Jane insisted, "ever since you cut her off. She's been alone and miserable. She just wants a chance to fix things." I wanted to laugh at the irony. Mom had plenty of chances. She had 2 near-death experiences with Jaden and blamed me both times. She had insulted my parenting, dismissed my son's allergies as my alternative lifestyle, and called him a burden behind my back. And now, suddenly, she was suffering because I had finally stood my ground? Still, against my better judgment, I agreed. Mom answered the phone like nothing had happened, her voice sickeningly sweet, like she had already won. She started chatting casually, as if we were just catching up after a long time. I cut her off. "Why did you want to talk to me?" She sighed dramatically. "From the moment you shut me out, I've been suffering in silence. I've missed Jaden so much. I'm willing to accept any conditions you have, as long as I can be part of his life again." I nearly laughed. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She wasn't even acknowledging her mistakes. She was bargaining. She had realized that her guilt trips weren't working. So now she was negotiating, as if I would just forget everything because she was finally willing to accept conditions. I had nothing left to say. "No," I told her firmly. "You don't get to manipulate your way back in. Not this time." I hung up. For a while, Things were quiet. No calls. No drama. Even Jane stopped reaching out. Then, I got an invitation to a childhood friend's wedding. Normally, I wouldn't have attended, but she was someone who had been kind to me growing up. So I decided to make an exception. What I didn't anticipate was running into Jane and my mother. Jaden was thrilled to see his grandma, but my instincts kicked in immediately. I stayed close, watching their every interaction like a hawk. I greeted them both politely, keeping things neutral, but as I was about to go to my table, Mom grabbed my arm. "Can we talk?" I knew what this was. A public setting, an attempt to corner me into a reconciliation. I refused. I don't want to cause a scene, Mom. But then Jaden started crying. He wanted to be with his grandma. My heart clenched. I had worked so hard to keep him safe from her toxicity. But he didn't understand that. He only saw someone he loved, someone who, in his little mind, had never done anything wrong. He asked if we could sit together so he could spend time with grandma. I was trapped. If I said no, it would only hurt him more. If I said yes, I would be putting his safety at risk. In the end, I agreed. For one night only. Not for her. Not for Jane. For Jaden. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jaden's innocent request to sit with his grandmother during the wedding reception felt like a test. One I wasn't fully prepared for. He was too young to understand the complexities of our family's history. And his happiness, at that moment, meant more to me than my unresolved anger toward my mother. So I agreed. Without a formal seating chart. We ended up sharing a table. Jaden, of course, was thrilled. My mother, to my surprise, acted civilly, focusing all her attention on him. Jane and I, after everything that had happened, found ourselves reconnecting in a way we hadn't in years. At some point in the evening, she offered a quiet apology for how she had blamed me in the past. "I see things differently now," she admitted. "I should have understood sooner." Her words mattered more than I expected. Maybe because, despite everything, Jane had always been my sister first. The evening ended without incident, until we reached the parking lot. As we were saying our goodbyes, my mother stopped me. "Did I do something wrong tonight?" she asked hesitantly. I sighed, already knowing where this was headed. "No, tonight was fine," she nodded, biting her lip, then pushed forward. "Then, based on tonight, don't you think I deserve another chance?" There it was. The question I had been dreading all night. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before answering. "I let you be around Jaden tonight because it was the only practical option," I said firmly. "That doesn't erase what's happened before. You endangered his life, twice, and never took real responsibility. I will not take that risk again, even if it makes me the villain in his eyes." The moment the words left my mouth, her face crumpled, tears welled up, and in seconds, she was sobbing. Jane, caught off guard, tried to calm her down. But Mom was inconsolable. "I raised you," she wailed, her voice growing louder. "I was a single mother. And this is how you treat me?" I saw the shift happening, the tantrum building. People in the parking lot started turning their heads, curious about the commotion. I glanced at Jaden, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes. That was my cue to leave. I took Jaden's hand, but Mom reached out, trying to coax him toward her. "Jaden, baby, come with Grandma," she pleaded, her voice desperate. But he hesitated, clinging to my side. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew enough to feel uneasy. When she saw his hesitation, her sobs turned into full-blown wailing. It was too much, too loud, too dramatic. I picked Jaden up and walked away, ignoring the stares of strangers as I strapped him into his seat. Mom's cries echoed in the background, but I didn't look back. That night, after putting Jaden to bed, I called Jane. She answered in hushed tones. "I couldn't talk earlier," she admitted. Mom was hysterical. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "And now what?" Jane hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think something's really wrong." For the first time, we were on the same page. I shared my concerns with her, how I feared Mom might escalate, how I had even considered moving if things didn't improve. Jane, to my surprise, suggested something drastic. "If she doesn't get better," she said, "you might need to consider a restraining order." I didn't disagree. A month passed, and for the first time in a long time, there was silence. Jane had taken action. She had convinced Mom to see a professional. And after thorough evaluation, She was diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder. It all made sense. The mood swings, the manipulation, the extreme reactions, the need to control. A psychiatrist recommended that Mom be admitted to a private mental health institution for better care. Surprisingly, she agreed. The institution was in another state, so Jane would be accompanying her for the intake process. I offered to help financially, knowing Jane didn't have the resources for something like this. But to my surprise, she turned me down. Mom is covering the cost herself, she said. For once, she's taking responsibility. That alone felt like a turning point. Before Jane left, she passed on one last message. Mom wanted me to tell Jaden that she'll get better soon and see him when you allow it. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. But for the first time in years, I felt something close to closure. I wasn't sure what the future would hold. Maybe, one day, when Jaden was older, he would get to decide for himself if he wanted a relationship with his grandmother. But until then, I would protect him, because that's what a mother does.